Welcome to Poe and Fiction, Part 2. I'm glad to see some of you are back for Part 2, and welcome to those of you who have just joined us. We have 3 presenters today, 2 in person, and 1 person is joining us virtually. And our first presenter, I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody here at the beginning. And then when we do Q&A, when we do Q&A, I will have the people in the room come up to the microphone if they have a question. And if you are online, you can use the raise hand icon, and I will ask that you open your mic when I recognize you. All right, so our first presenter is Andrew Rimby. He is a Ph.D. candidate and queer activist at Stony Brook University, researching 19th century literature from a queer transatlantic perspective. He is the 2019 inaugural recipient of the Guiliano Global Fellowship, a 2019 to 2020 Public Humanities Fellow, a 2019 Stony Brook Graduate Fellow in the Arts, Humanities, and Lettered Social Sciences, and recently a Spring 2022, I want to say IDEA, just say that? Okay, it's an acronym, IDEA Grad Fellow. He is the executive director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, a public humanities podcast that features literary and artistic interviews, and he may be soliciting some of us, I hear. Great. He is the curator of the Whitman Tane Library for the Walt Whitman Initiative, where he also serves as a board member, and he recently published Talking Back to Walt Whitman in 19th-Century Gender Studies. He is the associate editor for the Watchung, oh, just pronounce all the letters, sorry, Watchung Review. Our second
First, thank you, Amy, and thank you to everyone at this 5th International Edgar Allan Poe Conference. First, he's actually in the room. This talk would not be possible without the scholarly conversations I've had with John Colin-Gruser, David Grevin, and Susan Shekel, my dissertation advisor. So I've been thinking through this talk, which is more of a work through of an analysis that I really want to expand into a scholarly article. So I'm looking to all of you out there for questions I'll be asking that hopefully can come up in the Q&A. So the trajectory of my presentation, I'll go through my bulleted list. 1, I'm identifying the Narcissus myth in the story of the fall of the House of Usher. 2, how does homoerotic desire get established between Roderick and the narrator? 3, bringing in some psychoanalytic discussions on male homosexuality from the late 19th to the early 20th century and how it connects to narcissism, starting with sexual inversion and going into Freud, and applying this theory to Poe's subversion, that's my analysis, of the Narcissus myth and what this says about how male homoerotic desire can be read in the story. 5, turning to popular adaptations, including the 1960 film directed by Roger Corman, starring Vincent Price, and Philip Glass's opera, specifically how the 2013 Chicago Opera Company queerly interpreted Philip Glass's opera. And 6, I hope to have you all rethink Madeline's premature burial and why she interrupts Roderick and the narrator. Okay, so a little brief recap of the Narcissus myth for all of you out there. There's actually 2 versions, so I'll quickly explain the Greek version. So the Greek version of the myth, as we're getting the slide up. So the Greek version of the myth, according to Conan, Aminius is a young man who falls in love with Narcissus, and Aminius is spurned by Narcissus, who actually gives Aminius a sword, and unfortunately, Aminius kills himself at Narcissus's doorstep, and Narcissus, and this is where it's very similar to the Greco-Roman version, is walking by a lake or a river and decides to drink some water. He sees his reflection in the water and is surprised by the beauty he sees. He becomes so entranced by the reflection of himself that he's found his object of desire, and he dies at the banks of the river. So, not to read through the full Greco-Roman version, the only difference is Echo is introduced in the Greco-Roman version. Echo is a water nymph, and she constantly is trying to seek Narcissus's desire, attention. However, he spurns her, and Narcissus is cursed to fall in love with his own image, and again wastes away by the water and dies. Okay, so trying to target the Narcissus myth in The Fall of the House of Usher, we start with our first encounter, which is the narrator, saying, "I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder, even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted," important word, "images of the gray sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows." So, why is the narrator not reflected back in the tarn while he's looking into the tarn water, but rather the Gothic images of the gray sedge, sedge is a grass-like plant, and ghastly tree stems are brought up in the tarn's image? Also, the word inverted calls to mind the medical theory and one of the earliest theorizations of homosexuality called sexual inversion, something I will talk about in more depth later. For the Narcissus myth, Poe is subverting the story of the Narcissus myth, and I analyze that through this subversion, this is where our evidence for homoeroticism between the narrator and Roderick begins. Now, establishing homoerotic desire between Roderick and the narrator. Again, I'm not going to talk yet about the 1960 film version, but I will. Notice, though, how Vincent Price lovingly has his hand on the character Philip Winthrop, who becomes our named narrator. But again, there's a lot of plot differences, so I'm going to touch that later on. But back to the story of The Fall of the House of Usher. These 4 quotes are very important because in my analysis, they provide the homoerotic connection between the narrator and Roderick. First, quote, "Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting," end quote. The next, quote, "Although as boys we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend," end quote. The third, quote, "It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood," end quote. And our last one, quote, "For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament." Okay, so I analyzed that each of these quotes set the stage for how the narrator is defining and then eventually going to try to act on his homoerotic desire. But it is important to note that it is the narrator who sets the stage for this homoerotic desire. So, I'm not going to analyze in depth the French version of Usher, but it is our first film version in 1928. I'm not going to attempt to say the name in French either, but Jean Epstein, the director, interestingly, this looks very Dorian Gray-like, and keep Dorian Gray in the back of your mind because we're going to see the same kind of image in the 1960 film. However, inverted in this mirror is, again, though, this is Roderick. Not Roderick, but Madeline, his twin. So here, Gene Epstein is actually inverting the myth of Narcissus to really draw attention to the mirroring of the twins. So a very fascinating interpretation, but not one I'm going down. However, I do want to provide a brief Freudian lesson to think through how the House of Usher and Roderick's mannerisms affect the narrator's state of mind. Yesterday, Tomoko Kono reminded us when she analyzed mesmerism in the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, that Sigmund Freud provides psychoanalytic foundation for interpreting dreams. I can't talk about on narcissism unless I first talk about the interpretation of dreams. Specifically, in chapter 5, the chapter is called Sex in Dreams. And interpretation of dreams comes out in 1899. We don't get on narcissism until 1914, so there's a lot of distance there. And this is Freud's wording, quote, talking about sex in dreams. Of many dreams it can be ascertained by a careful interpretation that they are even to be taken bisexually, inasmuch as they result in an irrefutable secondary interpretation in which they realize homosexual feelings, that is, feelings that are common to the normal sexual activity of the dreaming person, but that all dreams are to be interpreted bisexually seems to me to be a generalization as indemonstrable as it is improbable, which I should not like to support. Okay, so the reason I'm quoting that is because to better understand what Freud is getting at in his essay on narcissism, you already have to know that when he's interpreting sex in dreams, he already sees that there's this bisexual possibility. Okay, so Freud actually does not take his own advice about stopping with bisexuality in dreams and actually deepens his psychoerotic analysis in what I'm going to term queer desire. So, at the opening of Freud's On Narcissism, he starts to sexually pathologize, mostly men, who he categorizes as, quote, narcissists. Quote, the term narcissism is derived from clinical description and was chosen by Paul Nack in 1899 to denote the attitude of a person who treats his own body in the same way in which the body of a sexual object is ordinarily treated, who looks at it, that is to say, strokes it and fondles it, till he obtains complete satisfaction through these activities. Developed to this degree, narcissism has the significance of a perversion that has absorbed the whole of the subject's sexual life, and it will consequently exhibit the characteristics which we expect to meet within the study of all perversions. End quote. Okay, Freud is always a mouthful. However, Freud is actually wrong in who he credits. It is not Paul Nack in 1899 who coined the term narcissism. It is actually the British sexologist Havelock Ellis. So Havelock Ellis and John Addington Symonds worked together on one of the early key texts on sexology called Sexual Inversion. So, enter sexual inversion. Sexual inversion, in their analysis, came from the idea of Plato's Symposium, that men who were attracted to other men had a feminine soul within them, and that's why they acted romantically and erotically to other men. And the same goes for women, but like Freud, women get the short end of the shrift, sadly. So, as Stephen Broom explains in his introduction to Reflecting Narcissists, a Queer Aesthetic, the medical concept of homosexuality splits apart from the concept of sexual inversion in 1892, when Charles Gilbert Chaddock translates Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis. After homosexuality becomes coined in medical literature to refer to sexual identity, Havelock Ellis, and I've explained what he meant by sexual inversion, well, he comes back again and he actually starts to link narcissistic tendencies among homosexuals because he says they're interested in expressing an autoerotic object choice. So Ellis is contributing to the growing literature in the medical community about the psychological state of the, quote, homosexuals. And he is the first sexologist to conduct an objective case study about homosexuality, and he analyzes how homosexuals transcend sexual taboos. Freud terms homosexuality and goes a step further in terms of pathologizing them, that it's a perversity that, quote, opens up the possibilities for the designating of pathologies where before only moral crimes existed, like sodomy laws. Therefore, when Freud contributes his work on narcissism to the already burgeoning literature connecting homosexuals with narcissistic traits, he emphasizes the transgressive nature of homosexuality, since, like Ellis, Freud writes his work to emphasize how homosexuals have not completed their libidinal development. Therefore, Freud's understanding of the homosexual is influenced by late 19th century understandings around homosexuality that begins with Havelock Ellis and his work on sexual inversion. So there is our trajectory. And now I'm going to jump away from Freud. I think we've had enough Freud. Okay, so homoerotic triangulation is a concept that comes from Eve Sedgwick in her work Between Men in the late 1980s. In the film version, how many of you have seen the film? Okay, please add it to your list. Hopefully I convince you. In the film, the narrator is named Philip Winthrop, and he actually is betrothed to Madeline Usher. So this tug of war happens between Roderick, Philip, and Madeline, who Philip comes to the house of Usher not to actually console Roderick and his ailments, but actually to take away Madeline so he can marry her in Boston. So in the 1960 film too, again, no Vincent Price, looking very Dorian-like here, in my opinion, is actually knowingly burying his sister alive. So of course, scholarship in Poe's tale, there's a lot of speculation about how much Roderick actually knew of whether his sister was still alive when she was being entombed. In the film, though, played by Vincent Price in a very manic, hysteric way, thinks and knows his sister's actually alive because he sees her hands moving and he shuts the casket on her. And as Philip knows that Madeline is still alive because she's running around and shrieking from below, Roderick tells Philip to just ignore her. So it's a very maniacal interpretation. And I would actually argue that there is even more of a homoerotic context in this triangulation that's happening, but again, shared between Madeline as the woman in this triangle of desire. So after Madeline is supposedly dead in the film, Philip passes out on the guest bed after he actually tries to threaten Roderick with an axe, and he does not do it. And he has this very vivid erotic dream. It almost looks like Tevye's dream in the musical Fiddler on the Roof. And there is a close-up of Roderick beckoning Philip with his hand to come closer and closer to his face, as if Roderick has become vampiric-like. Okay, so would Freud interpret this dream in the film as having an erotic connotation? Well, obviously, it's Freud, and we all know Freud would never turn down an opportunity to interpret a dream as being based on erotic desire. So you would think the 1960 film adaptation would be more sexually charged. So I'm not talking just about homoerotic desire here, but just in terms of eroticism in general. However, Poe's tale, I argue, is actually more sexually charged, because while the narrator does not dream of Roderick burying his sister alive and then lasciviously beckoning the narrator closer and closer to his face in the tale, like the film version, the narrator in the story wakes up from a sensual dream. So, the dream. Quote, "An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened." Okay, so I'm going to cut off the quote, but what's really important to note here is the incubus. So note that the narrator is not visited by a succubus, but rather an incubus. And we have in the story as readers already been led to believe that the narrator has seen all of the Fuseli paintings that are within the House of Usher. So, of course, one of Fuseli's paintings, not named by Poe, but I'm doing a little speculative criticism, Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare in 1781 presents the incubus. The incubus is a male demon, and traditionally in folklore was supposed to impregnate a woman as she was sleeping, whereas a succubus would come to a male as a female demon. However, here we have another inversion of queerness. We have the male demon visiting the narrator. Thank you. In 2013, the Chicago Opera actually interpreted physical touch between Roderick and the narrator in very explicit ways. And I will, wrap up by ending with the quote of the touch that we see in the story, which is vastly different. But here, yes, there was a critic who, explained that purists of Philip Glass's opera, but specifically purists of Poe, were not so happy about this refashioning of a gay relationship. But as you can see, not only are Roderick and narrator expressing homoerotic desire, they're ending with a kiss. Okay, that does not happen in the story, but if it did, I would have even more strengthening analysis. Madeline disrupting homoerotic touch. This is where I end. So at the end of the story, to get us all there, the narrator decides that he's going to read that mad tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning to Roderick to try to calm his nerves. As he starts to read, that's actually, quote, when Roderick, quote, the narrator says this, "I became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic, and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity." Quote, "But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips." Okay, so what I propose to bring to bear is, yes, Madeline, in her white robe, enshrouded with blood, does interrupt Roderick and eventually the narrator from their reading. And, as we know, brings Roderick down, and ultimately the house all falls down as the narrator is running from this destruction. But what if Madeline is actually disrupting their homoerotic touch? Because right before she comes in is when Roderick flees and leaps to the door and the narrator places his hand on his shoulder. What if she's actually prohibiting homoerotic desire and acting as heteronormativity's force? Thank you.